Get her out of the way. She's just a deckhand. The mockery was lost in the chaos as a 2-ton torpedo broke free, hurtling across the steel deck. She didn't hesitate. She dove, saving a young sailor. The flight deck of the USS Vigilance was a symphony of controlled chaos, a world of roaring jet engines, percussive steam catapults, and the constant, urgent ballet of color-coded jerseys. Amidst it all, Alara Vance moved like a ghost. Her official designation was Ordnance Handler, a title as gray and anonymous as the haze shimmering off the steel. For months, this anonymity had been her armor. Head down, voice low, movements economical and precise. She was a study in deliberate obscurity. Each crate of munitions she guided from the elevator to the waiting F divided by a -18S was another brick in the wall she'd built around her past. She didn't want recognition. She wanted the quiet rhythm of the work, the physical exhaustion that left no room for memory. She was guiding a cart loaded with AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles along the yellow-striped path, her focus absolute. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and salt, a smell she had come to associate with a fragile peace. Then the sky shifted. A rogue gust of wind, a common treachery of the open ocean, tore across the deck with violent, unseen hands. It wasn't the force of the wind that mattered, but its angle. It whipped under the cuff of her blue deck shirt, peeling the heavy fabric back for a single, fateful second. There, stitched into the inner lining of her sleeve, was the anomaly. It wasn't large, no bigger than a silver dollar, but its design was an affront to the muted tones of the deck. A crimson starburst, sharp and brilliant, captured within a ring of matte black titanium. It was a design meant to be seen, to be understood, yet it was hidden away like a forbidden secret. Most eyes were on the jets, on the signals on the horizon, but not all of them. Petty Officer Javier "Javi" Reyes, a young aviation ordnance technician with an encyclopedic memory for military insignia, was waiting for his checklist sign-off. His gaze drifted, and in that 1 second he saw it. The flash of crimson and black. It wasn't just a patch. It was a symbol that jolted his memory, pulling a half-forgotten story from the deepest archives of scuttlebutt and classified lore. He'd seen a drawing of it once. In a redacted document, a grizzled chief had shown him as a cautionary tale. The unofficial commendation for a ghost unit. A mission so deeply buried it didn't officially exist. Operation Nightshade. The name itself was a whisper, a myth spoken of in hushed tones in secure briefing rooms. A mission that had gone so catastrophically wrong that the official record simply read, "No survivors. All assets lost." The Crimson Starburst was their sigil, a medal that was never meant to be worn by the living. Hobby's blood ran cold. The woman pushing the cart, Vance, he thought her name was quiet, efficient, and utterly unremarkable. She was also, according to the legend, supposed to be dead. He watched her sleeve fall back into place, concealing the impossible truth. For a moment, he did nothing. Reporting this felt like a betrayal, like pulling a pin on a grenade of unknown yield. But the rules were the rules, and a ghost on the deck of a nuclear carrier was a variable no one could afford to ignore. He lifted his cranial helmet's integrated mic, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. His heart hammered against his ribs. This could ruin her life, or it could save the ship from something he couldn't comprehend. He took a breath, the jet fuel sharp in his throat, and made the call. CIC, this is Reyes on the flight line. About a potential unauthorized insignia on a deckhand. Ordnance Handler Vance. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. It's a non-regulation design. Crimson Starburst, black titanium ring. It matches the profile for Nightshade. Silence followed. A dead space on the comms that felt heavier than the roar of the jets. He had just lit the fuse. Now, all he could do was wait for the explosion. High above the flight deck, in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the Combat Information Center, Rear Admiral Cade Sterling was a figure of calm authority. Surrounded by the glow of a dozen tactical displays, he processed information with a practiced, dispassionate eye. He was reviewing sortie readiness reports, his pen making sharp, decisive notes when the call from the deck crackled through a secondary channel. At first, the words were just background noise, another piece of the ship's constant data stream. Unauthorized insignia, deckhand. It was a matter for the master-at-arms, a minor breach of uniform discipline. He was about to delegate it when Javi's last words cut through his concentration like a shard of glass. Matches the profile for Nightshade. Sterling's hand froze mid-signature. The pen hovered over the paper, a droplet of black ink swelling at its tip. The ambient hum of the CIC seemed to fade away, replaced by a roaring in his ears. Nightshade. It wasn't a name he had heard spoken aloud in years. It was a locked file in his memory, a ghost he had buried under a mountain of subsequent commands and responsibilities. His mind flashed back, not to a briefing room, but to a sterile, windowless office in Norfolk. He had been a captain then, signing off on the operational parameters. He remembered the faces of the team, young, impossibly skilled, their eyes filled with a chilling certainty. He remembered the mission's objective, so audacious and so vital that it had been erased from the history books before it even began. And he remembered the aftermath, the terse, coded message that had arrived weeks later, the official report that listed every member of the team as killed in action, and the ceremony, if one could call it that. It wasn't in a grand hall, but in that same sterile office. There were no flags, no honor guard, no grieving families. Just him, a 2-star general he'd never seen before, and a handful of velvet boxes. Inside each was a medal, a crimson starburst in a ring of black titanium, a commendation that would never be entered into any official record. He had handed one to the young, stone-faced widow of the team's leader, the weight of the lie heavy in his hand. He died a hero, he had told her, knowing the world would never know his name, let alone his sacrifice. No survivors. That had been the final, immutable word. And now, a deckhand on his own ship was wearing their medal. Sterling stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped back on the linoleum. His XO looked up startled. "Admiral, hold all my calls," Sterling said, his voice a low growl. He didn't explain. He couldn't. How could he explain that a ghost from a buried operation, a soldier declared dead years ago, was currently moving missiles a few hundred feet below him? He strode out of the CIC, his polished shoes echoing in the passageway. His pace was deliberate, but a storm was raging inside him. This wasn't just a security breach. It was a desecration of a memory he had sworn to protect. It was a loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel a history that powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. Was she a fraud, some fantasist who had copied the design? Or was she something far more dangerous? He stepped out onto the Admiral's bridge, overlooked, the wind tearing at his uniform. The chaos of the deck spread out below him. He scanned the sea of blue, yellow, and green jerseys, his eyes sharp, searching, and then he saw her, Alara Vance, a lone figure pushing a cart, her movements fluid and unremarkable. From this distance, she was just another part of the machine, but Sterling knew better. A gear that was supposed to be broken, a part that was supposed to be buried, had just shown up in the heart of his engine, and he was going to find out why. Sterling descended from the flag bridge with the focused intensity of a predator. The controlled chaos of the flight deck parted before him, a silent wave of deference acknowledging his rank. He ignored the salutes, his eyes locked on the target. Alara was securing the missile cart near the catapult when his shadow fell over her. "Ordnance Handler Vance," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the engine roar with the clean, sharp edge of command. "Hold your position." Alara froze, her hand still on the cart's locking mechanism. She turned slowly, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. Her eyes, a startlingly pale gray, met his without flinching. "Sir, roll up your left sleeve," he ordered, his voice flat and devoid of preamble. The deck crew in the immediate vicinity tried to look busy, but their attention was a palpable force, drawn to the silent, high-stakes drama unfolding at the edge of the catapult. An admiral didn't come down to the deck to chat with a munitions loader. Alara's gaze didn't waver. "With all due respect, Admiral, I'm in the middle of a transfer." This Ordnance needs to be prepped for the next sortie. Her tone was even, respectful, but underlined with a spine of unyielding steel. I'm aware of the operational tempo. Petty Officer, Sterling's voice dropped, becoming colder. I'm also aware of my authority. Now the sleeve. A muscle in Alara's jaw tightened. She glanced at the F/18 waiting on the catapult, then back at him. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might refuse. The tension stretched thin, threatening to snap. Finally, with a slow, deliberate motion, she released the cart and moved her hand to her cuff, but stopped just short of lifting it. "Sir, what's stitched inside my uniform is personal," she stated, her voice low but firm. "Not when it's a symbol tied to a classified operation," he countered, his eyes boring into hers. "I know exactly what you're hiding in there, and you know you're not supposed to have it." Her mask finally cracked, a flicker of something, anger, regret, weariness, flashing in her eyes before being suppressed. She pulled her sleeve down, smoothing the fabric over the hidden secret. "Then you also know it's a matter that falls outside the standard chain of command." It was a masterful deflection, an appeal to a set of rules he himself was bound by. But Sterling would not be deterred. "You're right," he conceded, his voice dangerously soft. "So we'll discuss it outside the chain of command. Follow me." Now, he turned and strode toward a hatch leading below deck, not looking back, confident she would obey. After a moment's hesitation, she did, leaving the cart and the curious stares behind. He led her not to an office, but to a small, windowless damage control locker, the air thick with the smell of fire-retardant chemicals. The space was cramped, the bare metal bulkheads seeming to press in on them. He sealed the hatch, plunging them into a pocket of silence insulated from the ship's constant thrum. Without a word, Sterling reached into his tunic pocket. He withdrew a small, square box made of dark velvet. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was an identical medal, a crimson starburst in a ring of matte black titanium, mounted on a small, polished plaque. He held it out. "I was there when these were commissioned," he said, his voice a low, resonant growl. "And I was there when they were given to the widows. Every recipient of this medal was declared killed in action. So, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where did you get it?" Alara stared at the medal in the box, her expression unreadable. "You already know the answer to that. I want to hear it from you." "That's not going to happen, sir." He studied her, the silence stretching between them. The official report was unequivocal. No survivors. "Are you telling me the report was wrong?" She met his gaze, her pale eyes like chips of ice. "I'm not telling you anything, Admiral." He snapped the box shut, the sound echoing in the small space. "A ghost on my ship is a threat I can't quantify. A secret like the one you're carrying could tear this command apart. It could unravel careers all the way up to the Pentagon." He took a step closer, his presence filling the tiny room. "You have put me in an impossible position. So here's my offer. You will go back to your duties, but I will be watching every move you make. And the moment something goes wrong on that deck, the moment the chaos gets real, you will have exactly one chance to prove you deserve to wear that medal. Don't waste it." Alara returned to the flight deck like a stone dropped into a still pond. The splash was silent, but the ripples spread instantly. As she walked back to her ordnance cart, the air around her had changed. Conversations that had been animated moments before fell to hushed murmurs. Glances that used to slide past her now lingered, filled with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and a new, unwelcome hint of fear. She was no longer anonymous. She was a question mark, an anomaly publicly singled out by the Admiral himself. She picked up the handles of the cart, her knuckles white. She could feel Javi Reyes's eyes on her from across the deck. He wasn't glaring, but his look was heavy with the weight of his discovery, the burden of the secret he had unleashed. She didn't blame him. He was a good sailor following protocol. It was the secret itself that was the problem, a ghost that refused to stay buried. Later, in the controlled chaos of the mess hall, the story of the confrontation was already taking on the shape of a legend. Javi, cornered by his curious bunkmates, recounted what he'd seen. He kept his voice low, but in the echo chamber of a carrier, whispers traveled faster than jets. The Admiral walked right up to her, he said, pushing mashed potatoes around his plate. Didn't even look at the CO, just stared her down. Asked about her sleeve. What was on it? Another sailor asked, leaning in. I don't know, man. Something different. Red and black. Looked serious. She wouldn't show him. He took her below decks. 10 minutes later, she comes back up looking like she's seen a ghost. And the Admiral looks like he's the one who put it there. The story mutated with each retelling. By the time the night shift took over, Alara Vance was no longer just a quiet ordnance handler. She was a rogue agent, a disgraced officer, maybe even a spy. The crew, a tightly knit community built on trust and transparency, now had a mystery in its midst, and they reacted with the instinctive caution of a body rejecting a foreign object. Some gave her a wide berth in the narrow passageways. Others watched her with a challenging glint in their eyes, daring her to reveal her true nature. For Alara, the scrutiny was a familiar, suffocating pressure. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, of blending into the background so seamlessly that people forgot she was there. It was a survival mechanism honed in places far more dangerous than this. Now, that carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Her quiet life, the simple, repetitive work that had kept the ghosts at bay, was over. Every glance felt like an accusation, every whisper a judgment. Meanwhile, Admiral Sterling was waging his own quiet war. In his cabin, he initiated a series of encrypted inquiries, using his flag officer clearance to pry open Alara Vance's service record. What he received was a digital fortress. The file was a masterpiece of redaction, a document so thoroughly sanitized it was more black than white. Her name was there, her enlistment date, but everything else was gone. Her previous units were listed as classified. Her training history was a series of solid black bars. Commendations, disciplinary actions, deployment locations, all of it was erased. It was the file of a ghost, a non-person. He scrolled deeper, frustration mounting, until he found a supplemental annex, a digital footnote that had somehow escaped the heaviest censorship. It contained a single, maddeningly vague line: reassignment at member request. Duties, shipboard logistics. And next to it, a reason, rehabilitation pathway, confidential. Sterling stared at the words. Rehabilitation. From what? Combat stress? A mission gone wrong? Or something else entirely? The word didn't clarify. It only deepened the mystery. Someone, somewhere, had decided that the best place for a person with her history, whatever it was a menial job on a floating fortress, a place where she could be contained, monitored, and kept out of sight. They had tried to bury her in the heart of the machine, but the machine had a mind of its own, and Admiral Sterling was now its chief operator. He closed the file, the black bars seeming to mock him. The paper trail was a dead end. The only way to learn the truth about Alara Vance was to see what she did when the pressure was on. And on a carrier in the middle of the ocean, pressure was never far away. The chance Sterling had spoken of arrived sooner and more violently than anyone could have anticipated. It came not as a whisper, but as a scream of stressed metal and failing hydraulics. The afternoon was sliding towards the evening cycle, the deck a frantic but orderly hive of recovery operations. The weather was turning, a greasy swell rising from the south, and the air boss was trying to get every bird back on deck before the window closed. AV-22 Osprey, call sign Guardian 2-5, was on final approach. The massive tiltrotor aircraft was a marvel of engineering, but also notoriously complex. As it began its transition from airplane to helicopter mode for a vertical landing, something went terribly wrong. A sharp, percussive bang echoed across the deck, followed by a sickening lurch. One of the Osprey's engine nacelles failed to fully rotate, leaving the aircraft in a dangerously asymmetric state of flight. It wobbled precariously, fighting the controls, the pilot's strained voices crackling over the comms. Mayday, mayday. Guardian 2-5, we have a primary hydraulic failure. Unstable approach. On the deck, chaos erupted. The crash crew scrambled, their silver proximity suits a blur of motion. Sterling, watching from the island, barked orders into his mic, clearing the landing zone, trying to carve out a pocket of safety in the unfolding disaster. The Osprey slammed onto the deck, far harder than it should have. The impact was brutal, sending a shockwave through the steel plates. The aircraft bounced once, its landing gear groaning in protest, before settling at a sharp, unnatural angle. The crisis wasn't over. It had just begun. Inside the Osprey's open cargo bay, the sudden impact had catastrophic consequences. A heavy-duty cargo pallet, laden with 4 GBU 32 dams, a ton of precision-guided explosives, snapped its restraints. The massive pallet, weighing over 9,000 pounds, began to slide on the tilted floor, its momentum carrying it inexorably toward the open rear ramp. A young crew chief inside the bay screamed over the internal comms, a sound of pure terror. "Cargo loose. We got ordnance loose." If the pallet slid off the ramp and fell to the flight deck, the impact alone could detonate the bombs, turning a significant portion of the USS Vigilance into a crater of fire and twisted metal. The deck crew froze, a collective intake of breath, the only sound beneath the whine of the Osprey's struggling engines. They were trained for fires, for crashes, but this was a nightmare scenario. Alara Vance was 50 yards away, securing a munitions cart. She saw the Osprey hit, saw the sickening tilt, and understood the geometry of the disaster before anyone else had finished processing the pilot's mayday call. She didn't wait for an order. She didn't look to the Admiral for permission. She simply acted. She dropped what she was doing and sprinted across the deck, her movements impossibly fast and efficient. She didn't run in a straight line, but in a calculated arc, anticipating the trajectory of the sliding pallet. She vaulted over a tie-down chain, her boots barely seeming to touch the deck. She reached the Osprey's ramp just as the leading edge of the pallet began to teeter over the edge. The crew chief was trying desperately to brace it, his boots slipping on the hydraulic fluid, slicking the floor. He was going to be crushed. Alara didn't hesitate. She dove into the cargo bay, sliding low on the slick floor. She didn't try to stop the pallet with brute force. That would be suicide. Instead, she grabbed a heavy-duty cargo strap that had been torn from its anchor point. In a single, fluid motion, she looped it around a solid stanchion on the bulkhead and, using her body as a counterweight, hooked the other end onto a locking point on the pallet itself. It was an act of impossible leverage and timing. The strap snapped taut, the nylon screaming under the immense strain. The pallet shuddered, its momentum arrested and stopped, its forward wheels hanging precariously over the abyss of the flight deck, less than a foot from the edge. Silence. The immediate threat was contained, but the Osprey was still unstable, its pilot fighting to keep it from tipping further. Alara, still inside, didn't celebrate. She looked at the pilot through the cockpit door, her eyes locking with his. She didn't shout. She used a series of sharp, precise hand signals, the universal language of the flight deck. Ease power on starboard. Gentle. Hold. Now. Counter thrust port. She guided him like a conductor, her hands calming the storm. Following her signals, the pilot managed to redistribute the thrust, slowly leveling the aircraft until its weight settled evenly on its landing gear. Only then did she step back. She gave the terrified crew chief a sharp nod, then turned and walked calmly out of the cargo bay, melting back into the organized chaos as if she had just been tying her boot. High on the island, Sterling lowered his binoculars, his knuckles white. He had just watched a ghost save his ship, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that it was no coincidence. In the aftermath of the Osprey incident, a new kind of silence fell over the USS Vigilance. The whispers of suspicion about Alara Vance were replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. You couldn't argue with what you saw with your own eyes. But for Admiral Sterling, respect wasn't enough. He needed understanding. What he had witnessed wasn't just bravery. It was a display of instinct and expertise so profound it bordered on supernatural. It was the product of intense, specialized training, the kind that didn't appear on any standard service record. In his cabin, he replayed the flight deck's security footage of the incident over and over again. He watched it in slow motion, then frame by frame. He wasn't looking at the spectacle. He was dissecting the mechanics. He saw Alara's initial sprint. Not a panic dash, but a controlled burst, her path already accounting for obstacles. He saw the way she grabbed the cargo strap, her hands finding the hook without looking, a clear sign of muscle memory forged through endless repetition. He saw the hand signals she gave the pilot. They weren't the standard LSO, landing signal officer, signals. They were more precise, more technical, a dialect of command meant for moments of extreme crisis. This wasn't luck. This was science. Sterling knew he couldn't simply interrogate her. Her silence was a fortress, and he suspected that whatever secrets she kept were protected by orders that far outranked his own. So, he devised a different kind of test, one that was subtle, pervasive, and disguised as routine. The next day, he announced a fleet-wide safety initiative, mandating a series of comprehensive deck choreography audits to be conducted immediately. It was the perfect cover. To the crew, it was just another top-down mandate, a bureaucratic exercise in ticking boxes. But Sterling designed the audit himself, structuring it not to find what was wrong, but to see who could identify potential problems before they manifested. He placed Alara in a team tasked with inspecting the carrier's catapult and arresting gear systems, the heart of its operations. It was a complex, unforgiving environment, a maze of high-pressure steam lines, hydraulic reservoirs, and interwoven steel cables. It was a place where a single overlooked detail could lead to catastrophic failure. Alara approached the task with the same quiet diligence she applied to everything. She didn't grandstand or try to impress the audit officer. She simply worked. While others checked the primary systems, she focused on the periphery, the places where small errors accumulate. She ran her gloved hand along the underside of the steam pipe and found a faint vibration that indicated a loose mounting bracket, hidden from view. She didn't just report it. She retrieved a wrench and tightened it herself. She traced the path of a hydraulic hose and noticed it was routed over the sharp edge of a ladder rung. Over time, the vibration of the deck would cause it to chafe and eventually rupture. She rerouted it, secured it with a fresh clamp, and logged the correction without comment. During a simulated fuel spill drill, the team leader, a boisterous young officer, focused on the speed of their response. Alara, meanwhile, moved to the drainage scuppers. She found one partially clogged with debris. A real spill would have overwhelmed it, spreading flammable liquid across a wider area. She cleared it silently, her actions going unnoticed by the officer, but not by the camera Sterling had made sure was monitoring the area. He watched the live feed from his cabin, a growing sense of certainty solidifying within him. She wasn't just competent. She saw the entire system, not just its individual parts. She saw the connections, the potential points of failure, the invisible chain of cause and effect. She thought in terms of preventing crises, not just reacting to them. The audit officer's final report was glowing, praising the entire team's diligence. It mentioned Alara only as a contributing member, but Sterling knew the truth. She hadn't just contributed. She had been the audit. She had stress-tested his ship in ways his own officers hadn't thought to, and she had done it without anyone even realizing she was the one holding the test. He leaned back in his chair, the grainy image of her clearing the scupper frozen on his screen. The question was no longer if she was who he thought she was. The question was what he was going to do about it. He couldn't put a ghost back in the bottle, especially not one this capable. He had to find a way to use her, to integrate this impossible asset into his command structure. But to do that, he needed to understand not just what she could do, but how she thought. And that would require a more direct approach. The audit was complete, but Sterling's evaluation was not. He waited until the late afternoon, when the deck was being reset for the night cycle. He sent a runner to find Alara, with a simple, undeniable summons. The Admiral wants to see you. Catwalk 4. Catwalk 4 was a narrow, windswept walkway high on the starboard side of the island, offering a commanding view of the entire flight deck. It was exposed, noisy, and semi-private. The perfect place for a conversation you didn't want overheard but didn't want to hide in an office. When Alara arrived, Sterling was leaning against the railing, staring out at the horizon where the gray sea met a graying sky. The wind whipped his jacket and tore at her hair, forcing them to stand close to be heard. He didn't turn as she approached. "They say a carrier is the most complex machine ever built," he began, his voice calm, almost philosophical. "But it's not the steam catapults or the nuclear reactors that make it complex. It's the 1,000 decisions made every minute on that deck. 1,000 chances to get it right, or get it catastrophically wrong." Alara stood beside him, her hands tucked into her pockets, her gaze following his out to the sea. She said nothing, waiting. "The Osprey," he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were intense, analytical. "I've watched the footage 50 times. I saw what you did, but the cameras don't show me what you were thinking. I want you to walk me through it." It wasn't an accusation. It was a tactical problem presented by one professional to another. Alara was silent for a long moment, the wind howling around them. She seemed to be weighing her words, deciding how much of her process to reveal. "There wasn't time to think," she said finally, her voice even. "Only to assess." "Assess what?" he pressed. The crew chief was about to be crushed. The bombs were about to go over the side. Most people would have focused on one or the other. "Focusing on one creates another," she replied, her logic as clean and cold as the sea air. The problem wasn't the pilot. The problem wasn't the crew chief. The problem was uncontrolled momentum within an unstable system. The pallet was a symptom. The tilt of the aircraft was the disease. You can't solve one without addressing the other. Sterling listened, fascinated. This was the insight he had been searching for. "So you chose the cargo strap," he prompted. "Why that specific action?" "It was the only action that solved for 3 variables simultaneously," she explained, her gaze distant, as if replaying the event in her mind's eye. 1. It arrested the pallet's momentum, neutralizing the immediate threat to the deck. 2. It used the pallet's own weight to act as an anchor, which helped stabilize the aircraft's list. 3. It cleared my path to give instructions to the pilot. Any other action, trying to brace it, trying to pull the chief clear, would have solved one problem while creating 2 new ones. It was about finding the point of maximum efficiency. The point of maximum efficiency. It was the language of a systems analyst, of an engineer, not a standard deckhand. She didn't see chaos. She saw variables, systems, and solutions. She saw the whole board, not just the next move. That kind of thinking, Sterling said carefully, doesn't come from the standard training manual. That comes from experience. The kind of experience that gets people killed. A shadow passed over Alara's face, a fleeting glimpse of the ghost she kept locked away. "It's the kind of thinking that keeps others from joining them," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. He had his answer. It was more than he had hoped for and more than he was comfortable with. She was exactly what the medal represented. A high-level operator, a strategic thinker trained to function at the bleeding edge of conflict. And she had been hidden on his ship, disguised as a loader. He looked away from her, back at the deck below. The lights were coming on, casting long shadows. The ship was preparing for the night. "You requested this assignment," he stated. It wasn't a question. She didn't confirm or deny it. "You wanted to disappear," he continued. "To carry weight, do the work, and be left alone. I understand that. But after what you did with that Osprey, that's no longer an option. You've shown what you're capable of. And on my ship, capability is a resource. I intend to use it." He turned to face her fully, his expression grim. "You can't hide on the deck anymore, Vance. Because I'm about to put you right in the center of it." The conversation on the catwalk left an indelible mark on Sterling. He now possessed a dangerous piece of knowledge, a confirmation of a truth that officially didn't exist. Alara Vance was an asset of immense value, a strategic mind and a seasoned operator hidden in plain sight. Keeping her on munitions duty was like using a scalpel to open a tin can, a criminal waste of a precision instrument. But elevating her, using her skills, meant acknowledging her existence, and that would attract attention he wasn't sure he could manage. His decision was forced by a message that arrived late that night. It came not through standard naval channels, but via a highly encrypted, single-use communication link that bypassed the ship's comms officer entirely. The center was identified only by a single Greek letter, Omega. It was a designation Sterling recognized with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. It signified the highest, most secretive echelons of Special Operations Command, the people who had orchestrated Operation Nightshade in the first place. The message was brief and chillingly ambiguous. Asset viability on your vessel is confirmed. Your discretion in its management is authorized under the principle of operational necessity. All documentation must reflect this principle. No external inquiry will be initiated at this time. Acknowledge and delete. Sterling read it 3 times. It was a masterpiece of deniable authorization. It was not an order. It was a granting of permission, a shifting of immense responsibility entirely onto his shoulders. They knew about Alara. They knew what she had done. And they were telling him, in no uncertain terms, she's your problem now. Handle it. But if it goes wrong, you're on your own. The message was both a green light and a warning. It gave him the authority to act, but also painted a target on his back. Every decision he made regarding Alara would now be scrutinized, not by the Navy, but by the shadowy figures behind Omega. He typed a single character in reply, a simple A for acknowledged, and hit send. Then, as instructed, he watched as the message digitally shredded itself, leaving no trace it had ever existed. He sat in the silence of his cabin for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could follow Alara's wishes and leave her in the shadows, hoping no other crisis would force her hand. But that was a coward's choice. The Osprey incident had proven her value. To ignore that would be a dereliction of his duty to the 5,000 souls aboard his ship. He had to use her. He had to put her where her unique perspective, her ability to see the whole system, could do the most good. The next morning, he made his move. He called a meeting with the air boss and the deck chief. He didn't mention Alara's past or the Osprey incident. He framed it purely in terms of operational efficiency. I've been reviewing our deck safety protocols, he announced, his tone all business. I'm not satisfied. We're reactive. We respond to problems. I want us to be predictive. I want someone whose sole focus is to identify and mitigate risks before they become incidents. The air boss nodded. A dedicated safety observer. We can assign one of the senior yellow shirts. No, Sterling said firmly. I don't want a yellow shirt who's thinking about the next launch. I want someone outside that immediate loop, someone with a fresh perspective. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. I'm creating a temporary position, deck safety coordinator, and I'm assigning Petty Officer Vance to the role. The deck chief's eyebrows shot up. Vance? The ordnance handler? Sir, with all due respect, she's a blue shirt. She doesn't have the big picture experience. She has a different kind of experience, Sterling countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. She has my confidence. Her job will be to rove the deck during all flight operations. She will have the authority to pause any procedure she deems unsafe, pending your or my final say. She will report directly to me. Is that understood? The 2 men, sensing the finality in the Admiral's tone, could only nod. Yes, Admiral. It was done. He had moved his most valuable chess piece into a position of influence. He had given a ghost a name and a function. He had taken the immense risk Omega had handed him and doubled down. When Alara was informed of her new role, her reaction was a quiet, cold fury. This is a mistake, Admiral, she said to him in a private conversation. You're putting a spotlight on me. That's the last thing either of us wants. What I want, Sterling replied, his gaze unwavering, is to keep my ship and my crew safe. Your desire for anonymity is a luxury we can no longer afford. You have a skill set this ship needs. Your new job is to use it. Don't make me regret this decision. He had placed her in the crucible. Now, he would see if she was forged from the same steel he believed she was. For 2 days, Alara's new role as deck safety coordinator was a quiet success. She moved through the thunderous world of the flight deck like a phantom, her eyes constantly scanning, her presence a subtle but powerful influence. She didn't bark orders. She spoke in low tones to team leaders, pointing out a potential snag in a refueling line, suggesting a better angle for a tow tractor. The crew, still buzzing from the Osprey incident, listened. They saw her not as a boss, but as a secret weapon, someone who saw the invisible dangers. The rhythm of the deck became smoother, more efficient. Sterling watched, a sense of grim satisfaction growing within him. His gamble was paying off. Then, on the third day, the crucible he had placed her in was heated to a terrifying, incandescent white. The afternoon cycle was at its peak. The deck was a maelstrom of activity, with launches and recoveries happening in a rapid, overlapping sequence. The weather had turned again, a persistent, drizzling rain slicking the steel deck, reducing visibility and making every movement treacherous. The crisis began with a sound that was both insignificant and horrifying. The sharp, metallic crack of failing metal. A specialized transport cradle was moving a Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo from the weapons elevator to a waiting P-8 Poseidon aircraft for a training load. The negative 48 Malawian Quachas is one of the most powerful weapons in the Navy's arsenal. A 21-foot-long, nearly 2-ton behemoth of advanced technology and high explosives. Due to a microscopic stress fracture, exacerbated by the constant vibration of the ship, a critical locking pin on the cradle sheared off. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of tortured steel, the cradle buckled. The massive cigar-shaped torpedo, freed from its restraints, tilted and then fell, hitting the slick deck with a thunderous boom. It didn't explode, but it began to roll. Panic, cold and absolute, flashed across the flight deck. A 2-ton, unguided weapon was now loose on a crowded, slippery surface. It picked up speed with terrifying rapidity, its path dictated by the slight camber of the deck. Its trajectory was taking it directly towards the ship's port side, where a team of deckhands was in the middle of a delicate refueling operation on a parked F-18. At the center of that group, his back to the unfolding disaster, was Javi Reyes. Shouts of warning were swallowed by the roar of the jets and the hiss of the rain. People scrambled to get out of the way, a wave of yellow, green, and blue jerseys scattering in terror. The torpedo, a gray harbinger of death, carved a path through the chaos, water spraying from its sides. It was aimed at Javi and his team like a bowling ball aimed at a set of pins. In 3 seconds, it would slam into the refueling station, crushing anyone in its path and potentially rupturing the jet's fuel tanks, creating an inferno. Alara was on the other side of the deck, monitoring an arresting gear cable. She heard the crack, saw the cradle collapse, and her mind processed the threat in a nanosecond. While everyone else was reacting to the torpedo, she was already calculating its path, its velocity, and the point of impact. Her blood ran cold when she saw where it was headed. Javi, the young sailor who had started it all. There was no time for a warning, no time for a plan. There was only time for action. She moved. Her sprint was an explosion of pure, focused energy. She didn't run away from the torpedo. She ran towards it, her path an intercept course. The crew watched in stunned disbelief. It was a suicide run. She wasn't aiming for the torpedo itself. She was aiming for a point just ahead of it. Bolted to the deck was a heavy-duty, solid steel wheel chock, a massive wedge used to secure aircraft. It weighed over 100 pounds. As she ran, she unhooked a spare mooring line from a bulkhead, a thick, heavy rope of braided synthetic fiber. She reached the chock a split second before the torpedo. She didn't try to lift it. She kicked it hard, sending it skidding across the wet deck into the torpedo's path. It wasn't enough. The torpedo hit the chock and simply knocked it aside, its momentum barely affected. But Alara had anticipated this. As the torpedo rolled past her, she did something that defied all logic and instinct. She threw herself onto its wet, cylindrical body, her boots scrabbling for purchase. She wrapped the mooring line. She carried around a heavy, recessed lifting point on the torpedo's casing. Then, with a surge of impossible strength, she leaped off, aiming for a nearby mooring cleat. A solid, mushroom-shaped piece of steel bolted directly to the carrier's frame. She landed, wrapped the rope around the cleat in a frantic, desperate loop, and braced herself. The rope snapped taut. The force was unimaginable, nearly tearing her arms from their sockets. Her boots scraped against the non-skid surface of the deck as she was dragged forward. But the cleat held, the rope held, and she held. The torpedo, its immense momentum now tethered to the very structure of the ship, was wrenched sideways. It slewed around in a violent, screeching arc, the sound of steel grinding on steel, a physical agony. Sparks flew, a shower of incandescent fire in the gray rain. It slid past Javi and his team, missing them by inches, and slammed to a halt against the base of the island superstructure with a final, deafening clang. Silence descended. The rain, the jets, the world, it all seemed to fade away. All that remained was the sight of the massive torpedo, steaming in the rain, and the lone figure of Alara Vance, still holding the rope, her body trembling with adrenaline, standing between the crew and certain death. For a long, breathless moment, the flight deck was a frozen tableau. The only movement was the rain falling on the still, gray torpedo and the steam rising from Alara's trembling hands, raw from the friction of the rope. Javi Reyes stood paralyzed, staring at the massive weapon that had stopped just shy of ending his life. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, and looked at Alara. She hadn't just saved him. She had defied physics to do it. The spell was broken by the crackle of the ship-wide public address system, the 1MC. Every speaker on the vessel came to life, and Admiral Sterling's voice boomed across the deck, clear, calm, and radiating an absolute, unshakable authority. "All hands, this is the Admiral." His voice cut through the shock, commanding the attention of every soul on board. "Secure all flight deck operations. I repeat, secure all flight deck operations. Damage control teams to the port side, forward of the island. Medical team to standby." There was a pause, a perfectly timed beat that allowed the initial orders to sink in and the crew to begin moving. Then his voice returned, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer just the voice of a commander in a crisis. It was the voice of a leader about to reshape the reality of his command. "Petty Officer Vance," he said, his voice echoing from every corner of the ship, from the mess decks to the engine rooms. He was speaking to her, but his audience was the entire crew. "Report to the island." Immediately, Alara let the rope fall from her raw hands. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and began the long walk across the deck. The crew parted before her, their faces a mixture of shock, gratitude, and a dawning, profound respect. The whispers, the suspicion, the rumors, all of it was gone, burned away in the fiery shower of sparks from the torpedo. She was no longer a mystery. She was a hero. As she climbed the ladder to the flag bridge, Sterling's voice came over the 1MC again, this time with a hard, decisive edge. "Effective immediately," he announced, his words ringing with the weight of an irrevocable decree. "I am making a permanent change to the deck command structure. Petty Officer Alara Vance is hereby appointed Deck Coordination Supervisor. Her authority on this flight deck in all matters of safety and operational flow is second only to the air boss and myself. Her instructions will be followed as if they were my own. There will be no questions. There will be no debate. We are done with whispers. We are done with rumors. We are about the business of running this warship, and Petty Officer Vance has just demonstrated the standard I expect from every one of you." It was an unprecedented move. A public, on-the-spot promotion that bypassed layers of naval bureaucracy. He wasn't just giving her a new job. He was investing her with his own authority, publicly and unequivocally. He was drawing a line in the sand. She was not a ghost to be hidden. She was an asset to be utilized, a standard to be emulated. When Alara entered the flag bridge, soaked and trembling, Sterling was waiting for her. He didn't offer praise or congratulations. He simply looked at her, his eyes conveying a deep, complex understanding. "I told you that you would have one chance," he said, his voice low, for her ears only. "You didn't waste it." He then handed her a dry towel and a headset that was patched directly into the command channel. "The deck is yours, Supervisor," he said. "Get cleaned up and get my aircraft ready to fly." It wasn't a request. It was a transfer of power. In the heart of the crisis, surrounded by the wreckage of the old order, a new one had been forged. Alara Vance, the ghost who wanted only to be invisible, was now one of the most powerful people on the flight deck of the USS Vigilance. There was no turning back. The Admiral's public declaration acted like a shockwave, instantly resetting the social and operational dynamics of the flight deck. The change was immediate and profound. Alara Vance was no longer an outsider, an object of suspicion. She was the new standard. The crew's perception of her shifted from mystery to legend. They had witnessed the impossible, and the person responsible was now at the center of their world. But Alara didn't act like a legend. She didn't adopt an air of command or seek the spotlight she now unwillingly owned. She was the same person she had been before, quiet, observant, economical in her words and actions. Yet everything was different. When she spoke, people didn't just listen, they acted. Her quiet suggestions were now treated as direct orders. Her presence in a sector of the deck made that team work with a sharper focus, a higher level of precision. She became a force multiplier, not through speeches or authority, but through example. She saw things others missed, not because she had better eyes, but because she saw the deck as an interconnected system. She would stop a young sailor and point to a tie-down chain. The tension is off by 5%, she'd say. See the micro-vibrations? That's how metal fatigue starts. She would walk a refueling team through a more efficient hose layout, saving them 30 seconds on every cycle. A lifetime in the world of carrier operations. Her relationship with Javi Reyes underwent the most significant transformation. The young technician, who had once viewed her with a mixture of fear and suspicion, now looked at her with unabashed reverence. He became her shadow, not out of orders, but out of a deep-seated desire to learn. He watched how she anticipated the flow of aircraft, how she positioned her teams not where they were needed now, but where they would be needed in 5 minutes. One afternoon, during a lull, Javi was overseeing the loading of a pallet of sonobuoys. He was following the standard procedure, but it was creating a minor bottleneck for a nearby tow tractor. Alara appeared at his side, seemingly from nowhere. "Reyes," she said, her voice calm. "You're thinking of this as a loading operation." Javi looked at her, confused. "It is a loading operation, ma'am." "No," she corrected him gently. "It's a traffic problem. The pallet is secondary. The flow of the deck is primary. If you rotate the pallet 90 degrees before you lift, you maintain a clear lane for the tractor. You lose 10 seconds on the load, but you save the deck 30 seconds of congestion." She pointed. "Solve for the whole system, not just your piece of it." She then walked away, leaving Javi staring at the pallet with a look of sudden, profound understanding. It was a lesson he would never forget. He wasn't just loading boxes anymore. He was managing chaos. Admiral Sterling watched this transformation from the island, a sense of vindication settling over him. He had made a high-stakes gamble, and had paid off in ways he hadn't even anticipated. The flight deck was running more safely and efficiently than ever before. The crews were more engaged, more focused. Alara hadn't just become a supervisor. She had become a teacher, her quiet competence rippling outwards, elevating the performance of everyone she came into contact with. He saw her one evening, long after flight operations had ceased, walking the empty deck alone. She was checking the tension on the arresting cables, her hand running along the thick steel wires, her head cocked as if listening to a secret they were telling her. She wasn't on duty. This wasn't part of her job. It was part of who she was. He knew then that he had done more than just promote a capable sailor. He had unleashed a force of nature. He had given her a place where her extraordinary skills could be used not for some dark, forgotten war, but for the protection of the men and women she served with. He had taken a ghost, a remnant of a buried past, and given her a new purpose. She was no longer hiding. She was standing watch. And because of her, the entire ship was safer. The standard had been raised. In the quiet solitude of his cabin, long after the thrum of flight operations had given way to the steady, deep heartbeat of the ship at night, Admiral Sterling sat at his desk. He was writing his official report on the torpedo incident. He detailed the mechanical failure, the crew's response, and the successful containment of the crisis. When he came to the section on personnel actions, he paused. He could have filled pages with commendations for Alara's heroism. Instead, he wrote a single, concise sentence that was, in its own way, the highest praise he could offer. Supervisor Vance's actions were not an anomaly. They represent a new standard of predictive risk mitigation for this command. He wasn't writing about a legend. He was codifying a new reality. He closed the report, his duty done. The secret of Operation Nightshade was still a secret, but the legacy of its sole survivor was now an open, official part of his ship's history. Miles away in the ship's berthing compartments, Alara sat on the edge of a wreck. The adrenaline of the day had long since faded, leaving behind a profound sense of weary calm. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from her past. She felt like she had finally found a place where it could coexist with her present. She reached in her locker and pulled out the small, cloth-wrapped pouch. She unwrapped it and held the metal in her palm. The crimson starburst seemed to pulse with a faint light in the dim cabin. It no longer felt like a burden, a secret to be hidden. It felt like a key, a reminder of the skills she possessed, skills that had, today, saved lives. It was not a symbol of what she had lost in the shadows of Nightshade, but of what she could now offer in the light of the flight deck. She looked at it for a long moment, then carefully wrapped it and put it away. She didn't need to hide it anymore, but she didn't need to display it either. The proof of its meaning was not in the metal itself, but in the work she did every day. She lay back, the gentle rocking of the ship a comforting cradle. She was no longer just a ghost, a survivor. She was a guardian. She had a purpose that was clear, tangible, and vital. She had a place. The ocean doesn't care about medals or backstories. It is a vast, unforgiving force that constantly tests the steel of ships and the resolve of those who sail them. It asks only one question, over and over again, in the crash of waves and the howl of the wind. When the moment comes, will you be ready? High on the island, Sterling stared out at the dark water, confident in the answer. Down below, Alara Vance closed her eyes, the rhythm of the ship lulling her to sleep, ready for the dawn. The ocean doesn't applaud. It asks if you will answer again. She would. This is Vigilant Valor, where heroes are forged in pressure, not praise. If you've ever had to step up when no one else would, share your story below. Comment respect. Like, subscribe, and stand by for the next dispatch.